The last 18 months have shown us the importance of the design, adoption, implementation, and advocacy of public policies. What are the major challenges facing policy professionals? How do careers differ in various policy sectors? Welcome to the School of Public Policy series profiling professionals with careers in public policy. Today, we invite you to join the conversation as we speak with Christian Soura about his career in policy at the state and national levels. Hi, I'm Whitney Sheridan, Director of Communications for the School of Public Policy at Penn State, along with Catherine Baumgardner, our Director of Professional Development and Student Engagement. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Whitney. It's exciting to be here today.
Our guest today is Penn State alumnus Christian Soura. He's the Executive Vice President of the South Carolina Hospital Association. Prior to his current role, Soura led the South Carolina Department of Health and Human Services and was president of the National Association of Medicaid Directors. He served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Nikki Haley with responsibility for the state's executive budget and the administration's policy initiatives. He's also a former Secretary of Administration for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Christian. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure, thanks for having me.
We're excited to have you join us. And we're also excited to have all of our guests here. This is an opportunity for you to speak with Christian about his career path and his experience. So we want to encourage your questions throughout the discussion. Don't hesitate to use the Q&A or the chat window at any point throughout the discussion. So Christian, to kick things off, I want to ask you what led you down your career path, introducing you to policy and politics.
Yeah, boy, that's pretty common. There's a lot going on in that question. I ask myself that question from time to time. I think maybe the first thing I might say is that I wouldn't want anybody to take the term career path to suggest that there was that much planning involved in it, right? That it is the road that or a set of roads, I guess, that I found myself on from time to time. And certainly I made some decisions that put me on those roads, but it's not like I sat there when I was 18 years old and said, when I grow up, I want to be a bureaucrat, right? I mean, you sort of find your way into these things. I think, for me, I grew up in a family that certainly had a lot of, sort of military service and other public service as kind of an expectation and as part of, what I was around growing up. And so, some kind of public service, I knew I'd be involved in some kind of, publicly beneficial thing. It was just not necessarily that clear what it was going to be. Wound up, obviously coming to Penn State, getting a couple degrees there, one someplace else. And most of those were oriented around politics or public administration in some way. But without necessarily having a clear picture of, this is the kind of policy I want to do. I want to be involved in these decisions and not those decisions. Really, in a lot of ways, I think to describe the path, so-called path, is at each couple year opportunity, sort of looked at what was out there, or people would call and say, hey, do you want to do this? I tended to follow what seemed to be the most interesting thing to do, and that's maybe not. I should probably lead off with this, warning. Maybe you shouldn't listen to my advice. It may not be the best. I can tell you my experience, and you can draw your own conclusions about whether that's something you should be doing too. For me, I've followed the work that I found to be interesting, and so far that seems to have worked out pretty well.
Wait, tell us about that first role, because you, coming out of school, you did not major in policy. You were international politics, correct?
Yeah, I majored in international politics.
Okay.
And the way that I sort of paid my way through college was to work at a mutual fund company.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked for a mutual fund company doing mostly IT work that related to real estate and like space planning and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And it paid the bills. So I sort of liked it from that perspective. That's where I was during the holidays. That's where I spent my summers and so forth. And I went back there originally after, I graduated early. I graduated in December. And so I went back there after graduation, graduated Saturday, back at work Monday morning. And, I wasn't necessarily sure what I was going to do, but I think, I did not find the financial services arena to be a very fulfilling one. And so pretty quickly, I thought, okay, now what? And for me, the answer was, back to grad school, and then ultimately wound up in a position where I had a joint appointment between Penn State School of Public Affairs and the Senate Appropriations Committee, where I got to sort of, be in both settings, do research, teaching, and then also do Appropriations Committee, budget and policy work from there. And so that was kind of the beginning of the departure into government.
Christian, your story is such a wonderful reinforcement of the crooked path that we often take to where we are in life. And just that following what interests you and kind of following your passions is such really wonderful advice. I'm curious about how your work with the Senate Appropriations Committee kind of gave you some insights into government. What did you find interesting about that, and how has it helped you in those
there's a lot of those
your
stories.
career path?
I probably still can't tell most of those stories, unfortunately. I will say, one thing that is great about, if you want to learn how government works, there is no better place to do it than working for an appropriations committee. The people who give out all the money are the ones who know exactly what's going on all the time. I think it was very much getting thrown into the fire, though. So, the Senate Appropriations Committee staff, I think there were 13 or 14 of us, and I had the fortune or misfortune of starting in June, and that's when we're usually doing budget enactment in Pennsylvania. So my first day was chaos, and I was in my office for 15 hours on my first day, and thought, is this what I just signed up for? These 15-hour days, making less per hour than I made when I was in high school. But you learn the ropes, and there's really not any substitute for that. I think there's no other place you can go to really see how all the pieces fit together. And and I still tend to think of myself as being a generalist, and I think at the Appropriations Committee, there's so many portfolios to be involved in, right? You can do, because the government spends money on everything. Anything that you're interested in, you can be involved in how money gets spent on that topic, and because you can connect almost any policy question to a question of funding, it gives you an excuse to be anywhere. So it was my first 4 years in government were with the Appropriations Committee of the Senate, and there were definitely days when you're sort of wondering whether you made the right life choices, but big picture, that prepared me for everything that came afterwards. Of the 16 years I spent in government, I learned a disproportionate share of how things work in that initial period.
I want to encourage our attendees to join the conversation and ask your questions. We're waiting for your questions via the chat or the Q&A at any point throughout the discussion. So, Christian, you're talking about being a generalist, being able to kind of sample different policy areas and different assignments. What are you're mentioning some of the advantages, but maybe talk a little bit more about that if you could, especially for some of our soon-to-be grads, current students who are maybe not quite figuring out what they want to do yet. What are some of the advantages of getting that opportunity to figure out what you want to do?
Well, yeah, one of the best ways to learn what you like is to learn what you don't like, and then to do something different, right? So sometimes you just kind of rule stuff out that way. Again, to the extent that I've had a plan, in my career, one thing I have kind of done is to sort of break it into sort of 2-year pieces, right? Where I try to kind of have sort of these kind of digestible chunks. And certainly working in politics makes it very easy to think on a 2-year basis, because everything in politics is on a 2-year basis, right? The legislative session's on that basis. You reelect House members every 2 years. We turn over half the Senate in Pennsylvania every 2 years. So it creates this very natural rhythm. I have plenty of friends who are constantly looking, to trade up, right? To find the next gig where they get a fancier title and they make another $7,000 or, that kind of. And in some ways, I think trying to do it in installments like that, frees your mind of that stuff the rest of the time. That you have a conscious decision to reconsider, and then you sort of recommit yourself for some period of time. And so I think that helped, quite a bit in kinds of the structuring of things. And it meant that it sort of lowers the stakes of any individual decision you make about a job, right? Because it's kind of like, I'm gonna do this for 2 years, we'll see what happens, right? And you might decide, This is the greatest gig ever. I wouldn't trade it for the world. You might say, hey, it turns out, real estate, IT systems are not interesting to me, and it's time to go do something different, or I don't, maybe I've done all the things I think I'm going to do on conservation easements and how we give tax credits for those, and it's time to do a different thing. I mean, so I think, sort of breaking your sort of career decisions into installments like that kind of lowers the stakes a little bit, makes it feel a little safer, taking risks to some degree. I think one of the other things that I probably came to appreciate a few years in career-wise was that, I'd always sort of consider myself as being, not much of a risk taker, as the, diagonally striped ties and white shirts probably suggest, right? I mean, I may have already revealed that to you, without having to use the words, but I think what we tend to downplay when we make decisions about things is the risk of the status quo, right? That you think about all the other things and all the risks that are associated with that. But there's lots of risks of not taking chances. There's lots of risks of being trapped where you are. And so, that's another one of the things that I'd sort of, kind of have rattling around my head as I'm making decisions about, what to do next. But, the world needs really good generalists, and there are plenty of positions out there where that's what they're looking for. Having been a secretary of administration, secretary of administration is like being the crown prince of generalists, right? It is the faceless, bland agency that has the most nondescript name you can think of. Everything boring and tedious sounds like administration, right? I think it's in an agency of generalists, you wind up being the person, kind of in the, the largest office in the corner, but like tons of interesting stuff to do. And a place where you can sort of see how, again, just like with the Senate, you can sort of see how all of the executive branch fits together and how everything, at the time there were 78,000 of us in Pennsylvania state government. You can sort of see what everybody's place is in this larger picture and how it all comes together in pursuit of a larger, hopefully common purpose.
Now, is that when you were part of the problem-solving task force?
Oh, that was, so there was a group called the Office of Management Productivity, which was a component of the Office of Administration. So I was, when I left the Senate, it was to work as a project manager for the Office of Management Productivity. And I went from there to being a deputy director of it, to director of that office, and then to being the secretary of administration. So I moved through those. That sort of full ladder inside of that agency.
We've actually gotten a couple of questions that I want to get to. First, well, let's go with this one first. Could you describe your timeline and how you got to where you are today? Which we are going to definitely get to where you are today. But first, I guess let's back up and start with your timeline, which is pretty extensive.
Yeah. So once upon a time in 1978. In Philadelphia, I guess that's the beginning of the timeline. So I was born in Philly. We moved around a little bit when I was a kid, but I lived in Westchester for a number of years. Lived in Downingtown for a while. Graduated from Downingtown High School, so I guess to the extent that I have a hometown, I guess you would either have to say it's Philly or Downingtown. Like 120 of my classmates at Downingtown High School, I went to Penn State. So. Plenty of familiar faces, right? I guess, in the college years, but graduated Penn State in '99, did a first master's degree at the University of Illinois in 2000 and 2000. I went back to Vanguard, after Penn State, and then got finished up in Illinois in 2001. And I was attached to the political science department there and the European Union Center. The EU has 10 research centers in the United States, and I was attached to one of the 10 of those. Did that, and then from there went directly to the Penn State Senate Appropriations Committee 2-year fellowship program, which obviously ran for approximately 2 years, as described. And then so I was there, and then stayed with the Senate, was with the Senate until 2005. Went into the administration from the Senate. So I was with the administration from 2005, and then that administration ended in January of 2011. So left Pennsylvania state government at that point, moved to South Carolina. I drove the moving truck through the night and was sworn back in the next morning in South Carolina as a as a member of South Carolina state government, and then spent 6 years doing that. So that takes us to 2017. And then in 2017, I came to work here for the Hospital Association.
Wow. And one of the questions we have is, how did you apply and get the Senate Appropriations Committee position, which was part of the fellowship? So I guess this is a great question for students.
Yeah, well, the question is better than the answer, unfortunately. So I was in Illinois at the time. So I was at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign campus, which is the sort of main campus. And I was in a PhD program and decided very early on that, full-time academics was probably not for me. I'm more interested in application. And so I pretty early on, I'm like, this is not a great fit. So I started looking at, well, what am I going to do instead? And, there wasn't a single clear path to me, as to what I might do. So I wound up applying for 3 jobs. One of them was that program, what was the School of Public Affairs Senate Fellowship Program. And they chose, at the time, they chose 1 person per year, and they did that for several years. And I think they've sunset the program since then. But so that was one thing I applied for. I also applied for a teaching job at a Northern Arizona University out in Flagstaff. And I applied to be a IT manager on a cruise ship based out of Miami. So those are the 3 things I applied for. And because the Senate called me back first, I went to work for the Senate. So that is how I wound up in government instead of working for Carnival Cruise Line.
Definitely that crooked path that Catherine was talking about. But it's really brought you to where you are today. I think a lot of it has shaped how these decisions have really shaped where you are today, which I really want to get to. Maybe talk a little bit about your current position and how your work in state government really shaped where you currently are with the hospital association.
The jobs I did in state government in South Carolina are, I was the state budget chief, and I was the governor's policy director and deputy chief of staff, which is kind of a miscellaneous sort of fixer kind of a job too. So I did that in Governor Haley's first term down here, and then in the second term, I went over and ran the Department of Health and Human Services. And while I was at HHS, I was also the president of the National Association of Medicaid Directors, and so I had a bunch of sort of national responsibilities that came with that. I mean, so those were kind of the slots I had down here, and so again, I mean, when you know how the budget works, and when you're involved in negotiating the budget each year. You get to know all of the sort of key legislative leaders. You're involved in putting together the most important legislative packages, because anything, in the words of Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, anything that's worth doing is worth doing for money. I mean, very rarely do you pass meaningful policy initiatives into law without writing a check to somebody to do something, right? I mean, all that stuff is going to be tied together. So I had a lot of experience working on those kinds of initiatives during my time with the government. So when I came over to work for the Hospital Association, one of the things I think you find in government, one of the frustrations is that there's this sort of sense of powerlessness that comes the further you move up the ladder, right? Which is not necessarily the way you would expect it to work, right? You would think that folks at the bottom feel like they don't get to make decisions and they don't have control over anything. Really, that sort of existential crisis just sort of changes form as you move from the bottom of the governmental org chart to the very top of it, right? And I got to go through literally every slot in between, right? I mean, I was an $8 an hour intern with no benefits, despite having 2 master's degrees, working for the Senate, when I first started. And then at the end, when I left government, I was the senior member of the governor's cabinet, right? I mean, so you can go, bottom to top. And you have a different sense of powerlessness every place you are, right? And the further you get up towards the top, the more you're sitting around thinking, I'm the secretary and I can't make anybody do anything, right? You're sitting there like you're fixing some spreadsheet and you're like, why am I fixing this spreadsheet? Shouldn't somebody else be fixing spreadsheets, or you're putting together a slide deck to go give a presentation someplace, and you're thinking, staff ought to be like, how is it that this is how I spend my time? Or why is it that we're spending money on ridiculous things and nobody figured that out before we got here, right? I mean, so you keep sort of facing those kinds of questions, and particularly when you're a department head, more and more you get pulled into, you spend 10% of your time doing press inquiries, right? Doing newspaper or TV interviews. You spend 20% of your time sitting in front of some committee getting screamed at because the legislative, because the person who chairs that legislative committee is actually going to run for governor against your boss, and they're trying to develop talking points to get their campaign ready. You spend so much time doing this stuff that often you feel like doesn't really add a lot of value. And you spend all your time thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great if I could go back and do the work that I thought I came over here to do? And so you try to figure out, how do I carve out more of my time to do real work? Or how do I hire people and reorganize this agency so that somebody at least is free to do real work while I'm wasting my time doing this nonsense, And so coming to the Hospital Association, one of the reasons I decided to come here when I left was I felt like it was in some ways a better place to do some of the work that I thought I was supposed to do when I worked for the government, but I didn't have time for it. And so now, as almost like an outside consultant to the government, I'm trying to get that work done from over here instead of downtown when I still worked for the machine itself. When you think about the role of interest groups or lobbyists or that kind of thing, many of the folks who are the most senior people in government, whether they're an executive branch or legislative branch, are just really, really busy people, and they only have so much time to study whatever technical issue or whatever other matter. And so often they're looking to somebody who can kind of give them, as objective as possible of a read on what's going on. And so, if you can present to them that's a place that, somewhere you can help them, a place where you can provide them with some support, they're usually pretty appreciative for that kind of help. And so in some ways, I feel like I'm doing a lot of the same stuff I used to do. I arguably have more time to do it now that I'm not directly inside the government anymore.
I want to ask you more about that, especially the way you communicate with everyone in your role, and in the various stakeholders that you work with. But we have some great questions coming in, including one from one of our MPP students, Nicole Heitzingrader, who asked, and this is a great one because you were just talking about feelings of not having as much power in various positions in government. She wants to know, in your time working in government, how have you seen the field change for women? Is it less male dominated? Which is a great question.
Yeah, a little, right? I went to work for the Senate, a little bit over 20 years ago. At the time, thinking about Pennsylvania politics, there were very few women in the legislature, and that fraction has ticked up over the course of the past several years. I think progress is at least being made there on that front. As somebody who's been more on the healthcare side in the last few years, in many ways the dynamic has been somewhat different in the healthcare industry. But to be very lazy about it, I think there's always been plenty of women in nursing. There have not necessarily been that many women who are MDs, or who are hospital executives, or who are in insurance company executives, right? And I think if you look at each one of these kind of, sort of career ladders inside the healthcare universe, some of these, there's enormous variation, right? Within each of those sort of silos as to, how far have they come along, on the gender front, and in some ways, the insurance companies, this is a very lazy overgeneralization, right? Like the insurance companies are kind of dragging their feet, it feels like, to get there. In part, it's a bit of an organizational, cultural thing to some degree. Nursing, we talked about a little bit. I think that the medical profession, I've seen meaningful progress, but in some ways, the medical profession has had an opportunity because of a generational turnover. The average age of an MD in the United States is, from a bit different from market to market, but closing in on 60 basically. And if you have a huge wave of retirements, sometimes that helps, sort of one, create more opportunities for advancement, but two, washes out some of the folks who probably were never going to, modernize their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, progress, but not fast enough.
Exactly. We have another question, and I want to encourage our attendees to keep asking these questions as well. Where would you say your international relations degree / the knowledge from that degree has been most useful?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, more useful than even my dad still wants to admit. I mean, so I'll start there. I mean, I have done tons of hiring through the years, right? In all the miscellaneous jobs that I had, right? I mean, so the Secretary of Administration of Pennsylvania is responsible for human resources across the entire government, right? And IT across the entire government. You have these big enterprise-wide responsibilities. And so you're involved in a lot of these decisions. I mean, the other thing that you handle as Secretary of Administration is all political patronage across the entire government. So every political appointee in the executive branch, you have a hand in sort of those transactions. I mean, the things, as I look at from job to job that I've been through, I mean, the things that I look for when I'm hiring somebody are critical thinking and analytical skills, right? Which international politics prepares you for, right? I mean, you can't do well as a student in those sectors if you don't have the ability to think and process and synthesize a lot of information. So I think useful there. Two, the ability to communicate, right? I mean, the ability to stand and deliver, but also to present a written argument that is coherent and not overly tedious. So that's pretty important, and it's something that, I mean, again, the liberal arts are going to train you for, right? I mean, you do a lot of writing, when you're in a liberal arts program. So hopefully you get some productive training there. And I think the third thing is initiative, right? Is you look for people who don't sit around waiting to be told what to do all the time, who are capable of figuring out what's the thing that I should be doing right now, and I'm going to go do that. And so, again, I think, the best students, are the ones who I think are capable of displaying that on their own. So, when you think about, the variety of jobs that are out there, I mean, you'll notice that nothing that I put on that list is subject matter expertise, right? It was all, traits or attributes or basic skills and abilities. I mean, now I said I don't hire a lot of neurosurgeons. I would not probably think that way about neurosurgeons. I would probably want to see a lot of subject matter expertise, right? But for many of the jobs you wind up hiring somebody for, you're looking for that stuff. And you think, I mean, you need to know enough about the subject to be able to sort of pick up the missing pieces. But, it is pretty hard, to teach a mid-career professional how to think if they haven't figured it out at that point. You're probably not going to teach them to be a better communicator by then. Except to sort of work around the edges or whatever. So, I mean, I think all that stuff has been directly related. I mean, I think, to give another sort of, I mean, again, this is a special case, right? But, it's another example of women in government, right? So I was, I worked for Governor Haley, and, I think, it is obviously publicly known that she went off to be, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. What has not, been sort of on the public record is that, I was also asked to go, and be an ambassador. There's a special UN ambassador for the United States for management and reform. And I was asked to go do that position and thought, very seriously about doing it. I mean, obviously that degree would have been extremely relevant, and my, later sort of master's, work would have as well. And actually, I mean, sort of a weird footnote, but that is a position that actually has it's almost like that position is earmarked for Pennsylvanians, right? So Governor Thornburg did the same thing for President Reagan after he left the governor's office. Joe Torsella, who had been the state treasurer. Joe actually ran the Office of Management and Productivity for Mayor Rendell when Rendell was the mayor of Philadelphia, and then of course I ran it when I was when he was the governor, and so that job for whatever reason seems to be hardwired for Pennsylvanians.
So it's interesting as I listen to you and I think about how the financial industry is what sort of drove you back to graduate school. You've found this path through government, but you've made some choices as to what pieces of government you want to be a part of, and you just gave an example of deciding not to take that path. That was most recently opened up to you. What were some of the factors that made you say, no, that's not the direction I want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mentioned making these career decisions in 2-year blocks. I signed up for government and was going to do 2 years, and my plan was to go back to the private sector after those 2 years and figure I checked my public service box, now it's time to go get paid and do whatever, and, so I wound up doing 8, 2-year terms. It was one thing when I was, being broke and single is not that hard. Being broke and married and having 2 kids, it turns out that now when you're doing the roll call inside the house, you find yourself being outvoted 3-1 on stuff on a pretty regular basis when you want to make those kinds of decisions. The home front, considerations were a strong factor weighing against going to New York to do the UN job. They all felt pretty strongly about it. 2, I certainly don't want to inject a whole lot of politics in it. I have worked for Democrats and Republicans, and I've spent years working on both sides of the aisle, which is a very uncommon thing in modern American politics. But, I just decided, as much as I believe in public service, I did not believe I could be part of that administration. And in the end, I made the decision. And I think, as important as the family stuff was, I think the final deal breaker for me was I couldn't be on that team in conscience. And so that mattered. And the other thing, and I can probably admit this now, is I talked to predecessors in that job. I talked to President Obama's ambassador for that job. I talked to 1 or 2 other who had that job in the past, and they actually. The Obama folks felt strongly that I should take the job because I think they felt like I was going to be pretty reasonable, and they felt like that was probably their best shot at having somebody who they consider reasonable. A couple of the other folks I'd talked to who'd had a job in the past said, boy, if you thought it was hard to get things done in Philly or hard to get things done in Harrisburg, wait till you see the United Nations. And one of the former ambassadors in particular said, and he gave me a couple war stories of, I'd spend 18 months working on some initiative that, and pour everything I've got into it. And then we'd go and the US would need Russia's vote on the Security Council for some totally unrelated issue. And they would trade away my initiative to get Russia's vote for that thing. And so I talked to folks and they would just say, they'd give some version of the "you can't fight City Hall" speech and said, especially if you're going to ruin your life at home, it's probably not worth ruining your life to not achieve things in that setting. And, I tend not to be fatalistic about stuff. I've taken plenty of hard jobs in my life, but, it's hard to discount that kind of advice from people who are, recent holders of these offices, giving you very real world and very tangible examples of what it meant for them and what they could and could not achieve. And certainly, I would never take a job where I didn't believe I could be successful, right? Like I would never take a job for a paycheck. I would never take it. In fact, all the times I've been, making a career decision in my life, I've literally never taken the job that offered the most money. If I had 3 offers on the table, I've never taken the one that paid the best. And so if that's the way you make decisions, it just didn't make sense for me.
I think it's a wonderful example of courage that it takes to really follow what feels right to you. And I know oftentimes, especially as our new graduates are coming out of school, it's easy to get flattered by the opportunities that are before you, and not always easy to say, I just don't think that's a right fit for me. I appreciate the courage that you're sharing with this group.
Thanks. Because others did not. There were some very unhappy people about.
Oh, I'm sure there were.
I'd already filled out my Senate Foreign Relations Committee paperwork and everything for the confirmation hearing, and it's tough. But in the end, I think when you let yourself get talked into a position that is not a fit, you're not doing anybody a favor, right? I would have gotten there. I probably would not have been. Realistically, I probably would not have been able to get much done, and I would have been miserable. And anybody within screaming distance of me probably would have been pretty unhappy too. So I can tell you, I recall very distinctly walking out of that room and down the street thinking, boy, I hope that wasn't the worst decision I've ever made. Because you go through years of training in international politics. I was a specialist in international organization. that job was the job. I mean, like for years, I would have thought that is the perfect job for me. And in many respects, in the abstract, it was. But you make decisions based on the facts on the ground. And it just, I mean, I have not looked back at any time in the years since and thought I blew that call. I mean, I continue to feel confident that was the right decision. As much as I still hate it, as much as I'm still mad about it, I still feel like I made the right decision.
Well, Christian, speaking of being success and the importance of feeling like you're successful in a job, I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about being successful in the way that you communicate, because such a big part of your job now and the roles you've had in the past have been communicating policy and giving these presentations that you've been talking about. Talk to us about what you've learned, the tactics that you employ, dealing with various stakeholders, on both ends of it, the policy experts that you deal with, and then the people that you have to translate these complex issues to.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I mean, like we spent 3 hours on that, right? I mean, the basic things I've tried to think about is, I mean, the basics of communication, right? I mean, who is the audience and what is the message, right? So if I'm going to go talk to a room full of senators, what do they know or not know about this topic already? What is the decision that is to be made here? And what information do they need in order to make that decision, right? So especially, I would say, I mean, I might separate out being a staffer from being a lobbyist, from being an advocate, from being a whatever, right? But I would think, folks in this audience are probably thinking more about staffer kind of jobs, at least the starting position. So it probably makes sense to start there. I mean, so, in the years when I worked for, the appropriations chairman or the governor or whatever, I mean, these are busy people and they are impatient people and they don't like mistakes and they don't like being lied to and they don't like having their time wasted. And, for me, I mean, especially coming out of kind of, an academic background, I mean, I want to write a gazillion page paper about everything. I want to footnote everything. I want to give you the full range of detail so you have a complete picture and you can make a perfectly informed decision. That is not the way decisions get made in any organization, right? Not just in government, but any big complex organization. The reality is that, if the governor's going to pay attention to you for 2 minutes, you've got to convey everything you can and get all the essentials across in those 2 minutes. And you got to make the very best use of that time you can. Understanding that he may ask you a question 9 seconds in, and you lose the next minute, in 51 seconds, and all you got is the 9 seconds you got out the door with, right? So, in terms of the communication stuff, you've got to be concise. You've got to be extremely organized. I mean, you tend to list, I love threes, right? Again, you grew up in a Marine Corps family and you want to make threes out of everything, right? Everything's a list of three. The units of three get put into the subunits of threes each. I mean, like, there's a reason, I mean, why the Marines have a pretty good track record. Going back to the Ton Tavern, I mean, there's a lot of wisdom in that, right? So, have that very clear organization. And when you go into an audience and you're there to make some presentation or whatever, you can't lie to people. I think people think about politics as being this fundamentally dishonest, profession or whatever. And I have found that to be not really very accurate at all. And especially the people who make it and who are respected and trusted and who survive and endure are the ones, and just the same in diplomacy, for that respect. People have to believe everything you say all the time. And if you don't know the answer to a question, you say, I don't know, but I'll find out, right? I mean, don't make it up. Don't fill in the gaps with some kind of, well, maybe it's this. I mean, like, no, just say what you know and stick to that. And I think especially, to pivot now from the staff side to more of a advocacy kind of a perspective or that kind of thing. You got to have an ask and you got to be clear about it, right? So if you're going in and you're meeting with the head of some committee or you're meeting with the governor or you're meeting with the president or whatever, if know exactly what the thing is that person can do that brings about the change that you are trying to bring about in the world. So don't be like, hey, it'd be great if you could do something about schools because I really like schools because I got kids. Like, okay, great. We all want that. Go in there and say, I want you to adjust the basic education funding formula by increasing the weighting for this thing from 7% to 12%, because if you do that, schools can pay for this service, and this service has an evidence base that shows it produces 4% better scores on NAEP scores, right? Like, you got to connect the dots, you got to build a logic model, you got to be able to explain why the thing that you want is the right thing, and then you have to pre-package and make it as easy as possible for the person on the other side of the table to do the thing you asked them for, right? So like, if I'm going to go and meet with, the head of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, I'm not going to say, "Oh, shucks, it'd be great if you could pass a law that does whatever." I'm going to go in there and say, "This is the thing I'm asking you to do. Here's why. Here's what other people have as competing explanations. Here's why they're wrong and I'm right. Also, I wrote the bill for you. And so if you, after you think about this for a while and talk to others, confer with staff or whatever, want to solve this problem, this is the way to solve it." And you've got to be able to sort of build that kind of package for folks.
Do you go in with like something in your back pocket if they have a question, like they might want an alternative that's slightly different, anything like that?
Yeah, I always give them three, right? So you got to give them three options.
That's one of the three. That's the
yeah.
one
So
of the three.
Yeah, I mean, no president, no governor, senator, or whatever wants to be told this is the thing to do, right?
This is it.
They want to feel like they're participating in the decision-making process, even if you are putting your thumb on the scale this much to try to skew towards option 2 or whatever, right? But yeah, I mean, often you go in with, here's kind of the crazy over the top solution. Here's the do nothing scenario, which leads to despair and the collapse of society. And then here's Goldilocks, which is the thing that I want you to do. And that's option 3, right? I mean, like, that's kind of an extreme example, but I mean, certainly you see lots of versions of that. Now, again, I mean, you spend more and more time working with the same person. And at some point, they may start to trust your judgment. I mean, so there's governors who I worked for, and, you start out with the full presentation, then notice, that kind of thing. 2 years later, you walk in their office and go, "I need you to sign this letter." And they go, "Oh, okay." And then they don't even read it, right? I mean, some of this comes down to, personal and direct relationships. And I would say, one of the reasons it never occurred to me I was going to spend all those years in Pennsylvania state government. In fact, I went to a job fair at the Bryce Jordan Center, where I was walking around, with a folder full of resumes and talking to people from all these different businesses and everything. And there was a lady there from the recruiting office for the Office of Administration in Pennsylvania state government. And I remember thinking, like, God, who would ever want to do that, right? And that lady worked for me, 15 years later, right? Or not even that. It never occurred to me. But one of the things I liked about Pennsylvania state government was that, or really to some degree here too, is you can meet everybody who matters, right? Like, you can have a personal relationship with all of the decision makers, and you can, build that level of trust, and you can go make things happen, on your own in a way that you never could in the national government, right? Like you disappear into a sea of other faceless people in Washington, or maybe you matter a lot on this little sort of super narrow micro boutique kind of an issue. But one of the things great about state government is that, number one, realistically, more of the stuff you're involved in really interacts with people's daily lives than a lot of the sort of esoteric stuff that the feds work on. But you can, you can be in a position in just a couple of years where you're doing real work that matters. That's just not an option that's available to you in plenty of other settings.
You've just given us such a great example of how one takes policy and works through the muddy parts of it to actually make it happen. So you went into government. You're still in government to some degree, even though tangential now. Lots of things have kept you there. What surprised you most about your roles in government, and what about you? What about the skills you've developed have made you so successful?
What's probably, I think, middle management in government is terrible, and middle management in lots of other places is probably bad too. Yeah. I've always seen it in so many other settings, but it's like uniquely terrible in government, and one of the things that, certainly I took away was, you spend all this time sitting in meetings talking about the work you'd be doing if you didn't sit in meetings all day. And you sit around and you kind of look, and at some point you're like, why don't we just stop having this meeting? Like we'd all be in a better place if we took this 1 hour every Tuesday and did real work instead of sitting here, coming up with excuses about why nothing's being accomplished. I mean, so I think the sort of general uselessness of most middle management became harder and harder to avoid in my years in government. And I guess, especially, I mean, we have so many different kind of, civil service rules and union contracts. There's a lot of that stuff in Pennsylvania government, at least not down here, but that sort of dictates that structure to some degree. But there's more layers, and there's more sort of pointlessness, I think, to that. I mean, again, I don't know. It's hard for me to remember at this point what kind of preconceived biases I had, rolling into my first day as a bureaucrat, right? But like, I don't think I would have thought the middle would be the worst part. I probably would have figured, like, oh, there's probably less professionalism down here and more time wasting, and then maybe it gets a little better as you go up. I don't know. But that was really hard to escape and really hard to fix. I guess in the second part, like what is it that I did that seems to have worked? I mean, I guess, some of it is just right place, right time stuff, right? I mean, there's only so much control that you ultimately have over these things. I mean, some of this, I mean, you think I have all the other folks I've talked to through the years about how do they wind up where they are. Everybody's story has got at least a couple points like that, where it's like, oh, my buddy called me and I wound up going to meet this person, and then I quit my job and did that instead, right? I mean, there's some element of chance, I guess, to it. Sure. But I mean, certainly, like, I mean, there's plenty of quotes out there. I guess you can choose the one that's your favorite about chance not really being entirely chance, right? That, like, the whole right place, right time thing. Usually you're doing something to put yourself into the right place at the right time in the first place. I think for me it was just I mean, what's worked is read constantly. Try to pay attention. I think in some ways, I mean, a lot of the stuff I've done in government is being like a unlicensed therapist. I mean, like, you sort of just listen to everybody talk about their problems all the time, and whether it's consciously or not, at some point you duct tape three of those things together mentally and be like, that representative complained about that problem in her district, and then that senator was talking about this other problem, and then that guy who runs that agency mentioned this thing, and I'm like, if you build a program that did X, Y, and Z, you could probably solve all three of their problems in a way that, each of those three might not care so much about the other pieces of it, but none of them would be offended by the inclusion of those other elements. So maybe we can make all three of those people happy, and nobody really be upset. So why don't we just try that? And I spent a lot of time doing that kind of thing, where you just kind of listen to people complain and then figure out how to solve as many of their problems as possible in a way that doesn't hopefully antagonize too many other people. And a lot of stuff got put together that kind of way. So, I mean, just listening and processing and trying to figure out how to put the pieces together. That gets you a lot of the way there.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask you about the importance of a lot of this. Sounds like it's very important to build these relationships, and that's a lot of your work. But also, I can imagine a lot of your work has to deal with some fairly polarizing issues, especially what we've been dealing with over the last 18 months. Can you talk a little bit about navigating some of that? And you're just mentioning having to handle some of those difficult personalities, or navigating some of that. Yeah. Maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, politically, healthcare has been a train wreck now for a decade, right? I mean, everybody's kind of gone to their opposite corners, and and you think about it. I mean, not that long ago, it wasn't like this. And I know it's very fashionable to talk about the good old days and things used to be wonderful and now they're terrible. And people have been doing that since people were sitting in caves, complaining about people who used to live in smaller caves that weren't as nice or whatever. So that's I try to remain conscious of that. But you think about things like when Medicaid and Medicare were created in 1965. Certainly one party put up more of the votes than the other, but there was a lot of bipartisan support for passing those things into law. Moving to a more recent example, Ronald Reagan expanded Medicaid 6 times, and nobody was running around, calling Ronald Reagan a communist, right? I think, not that long ago, people were willing to look at a lot of health issues as being, nonpartisan, or at least, minimally partisan, or that there were, these things are partisan, but this stuff everybody kind of agrees on. And we've obviously moved, away from that. over the course of the past few years, which has become kind of a tricky thing. For me, I think, how do you handle that? One is you try to find a place where maybe there's less of that. So for instance, I did some research here a couple of years ago and showed that the income level for the children's health insurance program, right? So your eligibility, for the children's health insurance program is a function of the household income where you live. And each state has its own rules about what the household income can be to be eligible for it. And I mentioned to members of the legislature on both sides of the aisle here that South Carolina had, dramatically less generous thresholds for that program than not just the national standard, but even the Southeastern region. And so I started talking about, eligibility for this health insurance program as being sort of a matter almost of like competitiveness, right? Like, why would you let people in Tennessee care more about their kids than you do? Right? Like, is that really the way? We don't feel that way about kids here, do we? And people are kind of like, yeah, wait a minute, we don't. Yeah, like, why are we losing to Tennessee, right? I mean, so you kind of can't talk about it as a public health issue. You have to sort of talk about it like this, competitiveness thing,
Mm-hmm.
And but sure enough, after talking about it that way for a while, passed a law that required that South Carolina bring its eligibility thresholds up to the regional standard, And so instead of going out there and saying, I think we should give away more health insurance to kids, which I couldn't have gotten any votes for on whatsoever, out of at least one of the conferences, I went out there and said, shouldn't we have a standard, of care for kids that is at least as good as our neighboring states? And that's a proposition that's kind of hard to say no to. It's not like I adopted a different position suddenly on whether kids should have health insurance. You just had to figure out a different way to frame it to get people to feel comfortable about it and to feel like it's a politically safe place for them to be, regardless of what the fringe folks are saying on the internet.
So we have just a few minutes left. And in those few minutes, Christian, I wanted to get your advice for our students about what you wish you knew maybe early in your career, what advice you would give our students and recent grads as they may be looking to follow a similar path.
Ooh, well, yeah, I don't know how similar path I would want to choose. Yeah. I think one, one of the many reasons to go to Penn State is to have options, right? There's plenty of small schools out there where, there's not that many, electives to choose from, or, maybe it's a pure liberal arts school. They don't do anything else. I think don't waste opportunities that are available to you. I took a class in astrobiology, right? If I would have gone, to Oberlin or whatever, I probably could not have taken a class in astrobiology. So I think,
right.
The degree program is flexible enough that you have a fair amount of latitude to take a few of those classes without putting yourself on a slower graduation timeline. Like I said, I got out a semester early. Don't waste that. Do interesting stuff, because in many cases, you're probably not going to have another opportunity to hang out with those kinds of people. I think on the risk-taking perspective, I talked a little bit about risk-taking earlier. I wish I would have adopted a looser, view of those things earlier in my life than I ultimately did. I think, by the time I probably came to see risk that way, I was already married and had kids and was in less of a position to roll the dice, on things when you're the one who's providing health insurance for everybody else in the house and, that kind of thing. It's, it sort of lowers your risk appetite to some degree. So I think, those are probably, a couple, at least sort of, narrow pieces of advice on that front. But like I said, a lot of it, I probably covered, at some point already kind of along the way, right? I think, don't pick a job because it's got the biggest price tag. I think that's a big mistake. I think who you work for is, we haven't done this at all, but who your boss is a really big deal in terms of your quality of life, right? Certainly the organization you work for matters. The work that you're going to be doing is very important, but you've really got to have a good feel for the individual who you're going to be answering to on a regular basis. And if, to go back to that line about, I wouldn't take a job where I didn't think I could be successful. If you go in and you're interviewing with somebody and you get a bad vibe and that person's going to be your boss, there's a lot of jobs out there. go find a different one. I think, I've, just as I've not really had a clear career path, I have had a very malleable definition of success. And so I think I've not been in a place where I've kind of been like, this is the job I've got to have. And if I don't have that job in 10 years, then my life was a failure, right? That often when I'm making decisions about, getting a job or whatever, I'm thinking about, let's say I'm looking at 3 different jobs that are sort of things I've applied for and have some chance of getting. I think you certainly want to think about that job, but you also want to think about, what are the jobs that job sets me up for? And not necessarily because you need to get to the top rung of the ladder as quickly as possible, but I think you just don't want to walk into the box canyon. Like, you don't want to go and take a job and then realize there's no place to go to from that gig. Maybe you're the kind of person who can take a job and do the same thing 20 years and be okay with that. I would go absolutely nuts. I do not have that kind of attention span, right? For me, a lot of the job decisions I've made have been about, preserving a path to other interesting things, right? Not just thinking about what's this job I want to take tomorrow, but thinking at least about, are the jobs that I might go to from that job also interesting to me? Or should I maybe, reconsider and sort of set this one aside and look at these other couple options that are out there?
Gotcha. That's great advice.
Nice.
Yes, definitely. We want to thank you so much for your time today, Christian. And thanks so much to all of our guests for asking their questions, all of our attendees. Thanks to our guest, Christian Soura, Executive Vice President of the South Carolina Hospital Association. And again, thank you to all our attendees for your questions. We hope you'll join us for the next conversation in our Policy Profiles series, Wednesday, November 10th at 3 o'clock, with guest John Richter, Federal Legislative Director at G2G Consulting. He'll be talking about his current role and his political campaign experience, including working on President Obama's 2008 campaign, the Clinton campaign, and the Biden-Harris campaign. He'll also discuss his work in the office of Senator Bob Casey, working on healthcare, veterans, science, technology, and telecommunications issues. I'm Whitney Sheridan with Catherine Baumgardner. For all of us with the School of Public Policy, thank you so much for watching. Thanks, Christian. We appreciate you being here with us. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.